anything you particularly wanted to be there to watch done?
I was very busy last fall, and when they invited me to go to South Africa, I first said no, I didn't have time. I was actually going to Tuscany with my son and some friends, and then I was going to Cuba. And they clearly wanted me to come, so finally I said, okay, I can go for this particular week. And so the week that I was there happened to be when they were filming certain scenes. So it wasn't that they requested me for those scenes or that I requested to be part of them, but it was a great selection. Because I was there when they filmed the scene where Alex Skarsgård, as the father, kills the infant. And that was a scene that, I mean, there was never a question of them leaving that scene out, but it was clearly I can't think of the word, a scene that had to be filmed very carefully. I know they planned the camera angle, for example, so that it would not show the needle being inserted. So I was glad to be there to watch that and to see how carefully it was being done. I also happened to be there for at least the first day of the filming of the ceremony. And in fact, they told me if I wanted to, I could play a cameo role and be one of the elders seated in the semicircle on the stage. And I said, no, I didn't care about doing that. And afterwards, I was so glad because I went to watch that filming. And I finally left at the end of 11 hours. Wow. I went back to my hotel, and those elders were still sitting there. And I was so glad I hadn't been one of them. So I was there after Taylor Swift had been there and before Meryl Streep came. So I was there with Brenton and Cameron and Odeya and Jeff and Katie Holmes and Alex. But I missed those other two important people. It was fun. It was also boring at times. I guess everybody who knows film production knows that, but I didn't. I thought it would be nonstop, interesting, and fun, and instead there was a lot of sitting around and being very bored. What was really more interesting to me and more fun was after the filming was done, they invited me to come down to New York for the post-production stuff, and I loved the editing room. If I were to be a filmmaker, that's the room I would like to sit in.
One of the differences from the book to the movie is the jobs that were assigned to Asher and Fiona. What do you think about that change? Did it make sense to you, or?
I have to stop and think now. I have to go back in my mind to the book. Fiona is assigned in the book to care for the old.
Taker, yeah.
And in fact, there had been an earlier scene in the book that I was kind of sorry that the movie had to lose for reasons of time. You know, they have to squish it into 90 minutes. And to keep moving scenes to different places would have made that difficult.
Right.
So instead of working with the old, Fiona now works with the babies, which makes sense. So that seemed a logical change. Asher's role became more important in the movie. In the book, he's kind of comic relief, and he's likable, and I enjoy writing that character, but he plays a greater role in the book, and a role that changes because he's first a friend, and then he becomes an enemy, and then he redeems himself. And that was a decision made after the filming was done, that Asher would be redeemed in a way, that he wouldn't try to destroy Jonas. So I think that was important to the film, that they beef up that role, as they did with the role of the chief elder, who in the book is a character, but she has no personality to speak of. And as soon as she turned into Meryl Streep, she became a much more important person, and her role became more complex and layered. And I've said on other occasions that I'm sorry I can't go back and rewrite the book and rewrite the role of the chief elder to match what Meryl Streep did with it after the screenwriters had given that role an enlarged importance. So I think all of the changes they made, including the two that you mentioned of the jobs of those two kids, were made for movie-making reasons and were appropriately made. I was worried at first about upping the age of the kids. I wanted them to be 12. Jeff says he did too. But, and I don't know the reasons they decided to make them older. But as soon as I saw Brenton not in person. I met him in person, but as soon as I saw him on the screen, on that bicycle, I thought, oh, it's okay. He's young, he's vulnerable, he's all the things that the boy in the book was. And it actually made the story more complex. Once he turned into a teenager, began to experience feelings, and had this beautiful friend, even though at my request they didn't make it a teenage romance, which I feared. Still, it worked, I think, for the movie to have them a little older.
Were you happy with the casting?
Yes. Jeff was always part of it. So he and I go back 18 years as he tried to get this movie made. I was astonished when they got Meryl Streep to play that role, because I hadn't yet read the screenplay, and I didn't realize that it was a bigger role than what I thought. And I remember thinking, why would she sign on to play this odd, unimportant character? But of course she isn't in the movie. One who surprised me was Katie Holmes. I was startled when they cast her as the mother. For one thing, I didn't think of her as old enough to be a mother of teenagers, but I guess she is. I myself had a baby when I was 20, so I could, at her age, be the mother of a teenager. But then I was surprised when I saw her in that role, because she's very chilling. She's not just a pretty face. So that was a pleasant surprise. The kids, of course, I didn't know. They were unknown to me. But all of them have proved to be perfect for the roles. And Alex Skarsgård, of course, he's known for being glamorous and romantic. So that was an odd choice, too. And yet, it almost works in his favor and in the movie's favor that somebody so attractive is so deeply treacherous. So I think all the casting was well done.
Were you happy with how they, sliced in those, or spliced in the memories, that the selection of the...
I have not seen the final version. I saw the film probably 2 weeks ago, and Philip, the director, told me yesterday that they had to make some changes in those memories. They were not able to get permission for some of the ones they had used. And I said to him, "You didn't lose Tiananmen Square, did you?" And he said, "No, that's there." Because I remember when I watched it during that segment, concluding, I think, with that iconic moment, I just almost, I didn't cry.
It was
but
beautiful.
Chills. It was beautifully done. So I'm not certain what's there now, but I think based on what I saw, I think they made good choices.
Yeah, I thought it wasn't in with the music that went along with it too. I was getting emotional practically in the theater.
I had
Right.
no idea with the music. When I saw it, it was before they'd added the music in. And I'm told that the music is wonderful.
They're beautiful scenes, with the...
So I'm looking forward to seeing it, but I probably won't have a chance to see it until the premiere.
And then I saw you at Comic-Con. Did you go to, we were doing interviews, but did you get to go into anything? Are you like a Comic-Con fan or anything
I
else?
avoided it. I didn't stay terribly long, and then I had to get an early morning flight out. So no, I didn't, aside from the hall where I was part of the panel, I didn't go to anything else. But I got to see everybody walking around, and that was enough. Every now and then a penguin would walk past. So it was interesting, but no, I didn't get to see very much of it. I had hoped to bring my 2 grandsons, who are 13 and 16, and they would have loved it, but things didn't fall together in place for me to bring them, so I didn't get to do that.
YA in the recent years has just kind of had this upswell in popularity, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about just, you wrote this very iconic YA book, and now it's just becoming more and more popular, just the evolution of the genre, and just seeing it come into this kind of larger fan base, I guess.
It's been very interesting. The book was published, the book The Giver. It's published, I think, in 92 or 3. And won the Newbery Medal that year, so it immediately got a lot of publicity and went into the schools. So right away it was popular, and it remained popular, and it also acquired a different audience from what I was used to. It was probably my 25th book, so I'd been around for a long time. But suddenly, and I don't know how this happened, suddenly I began getting letters from adults as well as kids. And I don't know how it veered into that audience, but it was interesting to me to watch that happen. And that stayed pretty steady. And the range of the audience, kids would write to me with school assignment, you know. The one letter that I have kept and quoted so often. This poor kid is probably grown by now, and if he ever hears that I'm quoting his letter written when he was 12. But please tell me all the similes and metaphors in the GIVER. I need this information by Thursday. So that's good. But at the same time, I continued to get all these letters from a broad spectrum of other audience, including one psychopath that the FBI had to intervene. He felt that he was the giver, and I was the only person who understood that. And they told me, and he was kind of threatening. They told me not to go to Des Moines, Iowa for at least a year. At any rate, but there was a Trappist monk. There were a number of psychiatrists who wrote to me because their patients were talking about this book. So at any rate, all of that was very interesting, but it stayed pretty steady for a number of years. In the meantime, Jeff is, trying to get this movie made. It isn't happening. And then quite suddenly, a year and a half or so ago, it became clear that the movie was going to happen. And also, at about the same time, or preceding that, all of these other dystopian novels began to appear. And they were movies much more easily made. Hunger Games and Divergent came out, last year, year before. So suddenly there was this explosion of dystopian literature. I've heard people say that The Giver was I've heard it even said the birth mother of the rest of this dystopian literature. I don't know if that's true, but apparently it was the first of that genre to be written for kids. So publishers now are really ready for it to end. The dystopian novels, they're tired of them. They want to move on to something else. But clearly there was a market for that, an audience for that. And I can only guess it's because young people today who live in a very troubled world are concerned about the future in a way that I wasn't growing up. After the Korean War, before Vietnam, I lived in this kind of bubble of safety, somewhat like the people in the book. But today's kids are facing, also I grew up in a world without television, so I wasn't confronted with the terrible news that we see every day. But my grandchildren are, and their peers are, and their contemporaries, and I think they're wondering about the future, what it holds for them, what their role will be, and I think that's why they've gravitated toward these speculative books that hold up some possibility of some kind of future. Mine, I confess I haven't read a lot of what's out there, so I don't know what they're presenting, except that I know The Hunger Games and Divergent both have a lot of violence in them, which I avoided in The Giver. But mine is optimistic, I think. Yeah. Presents the possibility of a young person changing the world. Nice to think that could happen. And that's, I think, why I reacted so strongly to that young man standing in front of that tank. I remember when I saw that happen live on television. I happened to be in France. I don't speak French, and the newscast was in French, but I saw this image of that young man in front of that tank. 1985, I think it was. And that has haunted me and stayed with me. And the fact that it's young people who go out there, as the boy does in the film, and tries to make a change. And some of you may know that I had a son who was lost in the military, who died in a fighter plane. And it was guys like him who think they can do good in this world and make a change. And Now I've forgotten what your question was. Because I talked on and on. Sorry.
What scenes were you excited to see translated on film?
I think maybe not a particular scene, although I do now recall that I was very interested in seeing, and I didn't see this film, so I didn't see it until afterward when I saw it in the editing room, when the boy and the giver meet for the first time. Slightly different from the book. I mean, just minor differences, because in the book the boy lies down and the giver touches his back. I got a letter once from a kid who said, would this be considered inappropriate touching? Anyway, so I don't know why they made that decision, but it's very effective the way it's done, and it certainly makes a beautiful visual image against that window. So it was wonderful to see that. But the thing that I guess I hadn't really thought about much, because it wasn't a particular scene, but I loved watching the boy, Jonas Brenton's relationship with the baby. And the baby, of course, was twins. And I don't know which one is in which scene, but there's a moment in the film, when I last saw it at least, where the baby is crying, and then he seems to hear something. He stops crying and looks up, and he has these big eyes. And I just remember thinking, how did they get that baby to do that? Probably by taking that scene 500 times until he did the right thing. But I was very impressed by the baby in the film.
Speaking of babies, in the book, the role of birth mother is seen as like not a good assignment. Why did you make that choice? I was curious.
I always have a hard time going back and trying to remember what was in my mind when I wrote something 21 years ago or however long it was. But clearly I was presenting a society that had evolved into holding different values from what we had. I had 4 children, and so the act of giving birth has always been very precious to me, and I think it is to most people, certainly to most women. So when I was shifting and changing the way people, what things they valued, that was something I just discounted. And that's why I created this odd set of girls who are assigned a task which is deemed to be of little importance, except that it produces the next generation. But they're by and large, I think they're depicted as girls who don't have any particular aptitude for a profession. And so it's a second-class role. But then, this is, of course, not in the movie of The Giver, but when I went on to write 3 more books that were related to The Giver, the 4th and final book depicts the girl giving birth to that baby, Gabe, who was immediately taken from her. And then the first book is less than 200 pages, and the 4th one is over 400, because I had many more characters to account for. But the entire 4th book is her search for that baby that's been taken from her. And so you do see by then, if you hang in there and read all 4 books, that the role of a birth mother is a much more complex role than first portrayed. For one thing, the girl no longer takes the medication, which represses emotions. So she does have feelings for this child she's lost. It was just to try to answer your question, it was just a decision made when I was creating the society with a whole different set of values, and relegated that one that is so important in our world to one that's so diminished in theirs.
In the book, you kind of hinted that Gabe and Jonas were related, possibly brothers. Is that?
I don't
Because they
think
have
I
the
did. They
funny
have the same color eyes. I
Yeah.
think I was using that, and it's not in the movie.
Yeah.
Partly because I think it was too difficult to put contact lenses in a baby and all of that. But the hook is here. I don't think it implies that they're necessarily related, but that they have the same characteristic, perhaps, the same gift. And in the book it's called, and in the movie it's called The Gift of Seeing Beyond. And Jonas realizes that this baby is one who has that as he does. And the other, his contemporaries and peers, don't have that gift.
What is your writing process? Like, do you have an outline? You know, do you know beginning, middle, end, or?
I always envy writers who are very organized and have outlines and index cards. I covet index cards, I guess. But I don't. I start with a character. A vague sense of, not plot so much as destination. A character, and I always try in the beginning of a book, and this is true of all my books, to place this character that I've envisioned in my imagination in a situation where something is not quite right. And the character has to make it right. And you know that early on. And in this particular book, you know it in the first sentence. When he says it, he doesn't say. The author says he was beginning to be scared, beginning to be frightened. So you know something's wrong. You don't know why he's frightened. But at any rate, you know that's got to be resolved by the end. So there is a journey he has to make. And then I sort of create the plot as I go along. In this case, I placed the character in a setting that was quite alien to what I'd written before, which were realistic settings. And so that became a participant in the plot. And I never know how exactly a book is going to end. But I do know, and I knew throughout this one, that it would end on a positive note. So I was surprised when readers sometimes thought that the boy and the baby were dead at the end. To me, it was always an optimistic ending. But I've had a number of kids, usually boys for some reason, who write and list the symptoms of hypothermia in order to prove that they're dead because they had all these symptoms. But to me, they were always alive and well and happy, and in fact had changed the world.